Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotet. So glad to see you well. Thanks so much for joining me. We have a ridiculous amount of content to cover in a short amount of time. We have stories about Star Wars, Jonathan Majors, a national security defense leak, HBO, or what it's now called as Max, and Coachella. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we're going to cover today. We're going to start in the realm of Star Wars. There's many fans of Star Wars in this world, quite a bit, and there's a scale, a gradient, right? Like casual fans all the way up through incredibly huge fans of Star Wars. Now, famously, after having been sold to Disney from George Lucas, Star Wars basically cranked out a series of the finale of the original story, the much famed Star Wars 1 through 9. So they basically finished where the original movies were 4, 5, and 6. And then the early 2000s movies were 1, 2, and 3. They then switched to doing 7, 8, and 9, which were called The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. And those movies were, I mean, worth it on some level, but then also, as much money as they made, and they certainly made a lot of money, that were not certainly critically beloved, and not everybody really loved them. The third one, in my opinion, was a gigantic mess and effectively kind of invalidated a lot of its own plot lines. Well, you fast forward a few years, and now we have Disney Plus, and Disney Plus has had a series of very successful shows in the respect of The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, and now there's another one coming, waiting in the wings, which is going to be Ahsoka, about as the character, much loved character Ahsoka Tano, and then many, many, many more things that they're kind of building to. Much of this all under the stewardship of Dave Filoni and the famed director producer Jon Favreau, who many of you know, going all the way back to Swingers, the movie Swingers, and effectively. They announced at a Star Wars celebration in London a few weeks ago, this effectively has now been expanded, and they're going to be doing 3 more movies. It had seemed for a minute there that, following that people didn't really love The Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi, that maybe they were shying away from movies. And there's been a lot of rumblings about projects started and then abandoned. There was even one by David Benoit and D.B. Weiss, who are the guys who were in charge of the original Game of Thrones series for HBO, maybe having something going on, and then that was announced that it was canceled. Well, they announced that there are 3 new movies coming, and they're each going to be helmed by a different director. One is going to be helmed by Dave Filoni, who, of course, as I mentioned, is the guy who's kind of the impresario behind the recent spate of very successful Disney Plus shows, and that's going to be about the New Republic era, basically following the events of the original movies, and ostensibly where the Mandalorian and Boba Fett and everything that has been on Disney Plus has been existing. Then there's also going to be James Mangold, who's going to have a movie. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, James Mangold is an excellent director, and he did the wonderful final Wolverine movie at the time, Logan, and he also did Walk the Line, which was the story about Johnny Cash, and then he also did one of my favorite movies of the last 20 years, 3:10 to Yuma. He's going to be doing a movie about the very beginnings of what the Jedi Order is, and whatever that may mean, 20,000 some odd years in the past from the story as far as anybody knows it. And then lastly, Charmin Obaid Chimay is going to be doing another story that's going to be based on Rey, the character who was one of the main characters in the most recent 7, 8, and 9 Star Wars movies, which was played by Daisy Ridley. And also, interestingly, they announced that Daisy Ridley is going to be returning to reprise the character, which she had kind of been. I mean, there was not a lot of like outward statements, but there was a kind of like a half said in an interview. She was looking forward to being done with doing the movies after so many years of doing them. It was kind of implied like she was kind of fed up with it. So surprising that she's back, but a lot of people really like that character. Elsewhere, and very complicated news, Jonathan Majors, who's been in a bit of a hit streak, we shall say, recently, and being one of the only good parts of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, playing the villain Kang the Conqueror, and of course showing up in the end of Loki the other year on Disney Plus, but then also Creed 3, which is a massive successful movie going out, and it came out this year. Jonathan Majors has been dropped by his management, Entertainment 360, and his PR firm, The Lead Company. And effectively, this all has to do with an alleged event that took place on March 25th. And the details of the event are sparse. We're not going to parse this too deeply, and we're not going to get into a very exact minutia of what happened. What is true is that he was arrested on alleged domestic violence charges. There was apparently a woman that had suffered some bruising, and then effectively he was, bailed out, and then is essentially, going through the court process and is basically issuing, already through his attorney a defense. And that's his attorney, Priya Chaudhry, where it has basically indicated, and this is, of course, according to her, Jonathan Majors is completely innocent, is probably the victim of an altercation with a woman he knows. We are quickly gathering and presenting evidence to the district attorney and the expectation that all charges will be dropped imminently. Now, she goes on to explain that she has evidence of the person that was injured in the altercation that ultimately led to Jonathan Majors being arrested. And this basically states, please let me know when you're okay. When you get this, they assured me that you won't be charged. They said they had to arrest you as protocol when they saw the injuries on me and they knew we had a fight. I'm so angry that they did. I'm sorry you're in this position. We'll make sure nothing happens about this. I told them it was my fault for trying to grab your phone. I only just got out of the hospital. Just call me when you're out. I love you. Now, what's true, what's not, we're not going to get deep into that because that's a whole thing. Who knows? There's a lot of very, significant legal consequences to stuff like this. But suffice it to say, what has been alleged has been enough that his management and, or at least apparently the cloud of the suspicion of it, the what might have been alleged is enough that his management firm and his PR company are not working with him anymore. What's important as of this point is that Marvel Studios, and of course Disney by extension of that, had ostensibly planned an elaborate series of appearances by the character that he played in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania and Loki. He'd already shot scenes for Loki season 2 to be, Kang, or one of the many different permutations of Kang. If you're not familiar with Kang the Conqueror, it's essentially an infinite number of versions of that character spread across the multiverse, and Jonathan Majors is playing every possible version. So essentially, right now, the plan was that they were going to build to a new series of Avengers movies, and one of them is literally called Avengers: The Kang Dynasty. And that's stated to be released, at least at this time. Sometimes big movies like this move around in terms of release date, but for May 2nd, 2025. As of this point, Marvel's made no comment on anything that's happened, and nothing has changed. Nothing's been announced, but obviously precarious because one of the biggest movie studios on the planet has ostensibly planned like their next several year arc of films leading into their big tentpole films and the Avengers, all based on Jonathan Majors being the main villain, kind of like, Josh Brolin was as Thanos. We'll keep you posted as new developments arise on that. Now, this next story is crazy. I mean, crazy in a way that a lot of stories aren't crazy. So, pretty much anybody who's watching this or seeing this is acutely familiar with the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and that there is a very, very bad war happening over there on Ukrainian soil. And it all goes down to, very complicated geopolitical matters of Russia's, belief that Ukraine is their territory and them casting all kinds of crazy aspersions on Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine saying we're a sovereign nation. You can't just take our country. We're not a part of Russia anymore. And, most of the world lining up to help financially support Ukraine in the aim of trying to help them push back the Russian army. And of course, Ukraine being one of the world's largest suppliers of grain and massive country with a massive population. Well, that's been going on for a year. That's a giant, ugly mess, and it's going to play out for a very long time. All U.S. intelligence assessments don't have the war ending anytime soon. Ukraine is saying that they're not going to stop fighting even for a second until they have everything, including Crimea, the area in the southwest that Russia took way, way, way back in 2013, 2014. And Russia is saying they're not going to stop till they have taken over everything in what they called a special military operation. We've had all kinds of satellite stories coming from this involving the group Pussy Riot and their, protests against Putin and his regime. And then, of course, there's all kinds of insane things that have come in the wake of a draconian crackdown within that country where you're not allowed to say anything that claims that it's a war. You can't say that Russia's done anything wrong. I mean, they can literally throw you in prison for 10 years for things that, like discrediting the military or spreading lies about the government. And, most heinous story being of which that there was a man whose daughter basically drew a picture in school and essentially said, something to the effect of no to war in Ukraine. And the teachers ratted on the child. The authorities took the child from the father, put her in an orphanage, and then he has now been arrested and is being thrown in federal prison for 10 years. So as bad as you think your world is, that is not your reality, and that's an important thing to remember. But at any rate, with all that mess happening and all the very complicated stuff that is our Department of, State and our Department of Defense in terms of interfacing with Ukraine, providing them money and weapons and the things to repel the Russian army, something appeared, basically kind of apparently had been there for a minute, took people a while to figure out what it was or what it had to do anything, but on a Discord server, which is the kind of live chat message board, maybe a video conference thing that has become very popular in lots of private communities. Kind of like if Reddit was a private community and also has like live video features where you can do like Zoom call-esque, different boxes for different people and the same video call kind of thing, all meant as kind of a private network. Well, apparently there was what they call a Discord server for the game Minecraft. Those of you that are familiar with, you know, young teens that play games, probably your nephew, or, maybe if you've got kids, your kids, your son, your daughter. And effectively that Minecraft is this insanely popular game, which Lego-ish, I wouldn't call it Legos, then no, but nobody would, but essentially you build things. And sometimes it can have adventure elements, but you build things, you plan things. It's cute, and it's really, really popular with people in that age bracket, be 8 to 14. And there's a newer version called Roblox. So at any rate, while this community, this one particular community, there was a giant set of classified documents that wound up on it. I mean, it's about as esoteric and random as it can possibly be. I mean, Minecraft as a game, as a hobby, has very little to do with national security or wars and conflict. And apparently this is all unraveled really quickly. Apparently it had been sitting on this Minecraft Discord for a while, eventually made it to Twitter, and then people started to work backwards, like where did it come from? And apparently it all came from a Discord group, a different Discord group called Thug Shaker Central. And this was essentially a conglomeration of people who were really big into war games, war video games. And there's certainly plenty of them. Just look at the Call of Duty series just alone, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole thing of like World of Tanks. There's a whole series of epic games where you just get in tank battles left, right, and center. So effectively, this group apparently had allegedly a participant who served as an admin named Jack Texera. And how he got this information, why he had this information, who knows, but allegedly he somehow came into possession of top secret classified documents and essentially was allegedly leaking them out into this Discord server. And, apparently, according to the New York Times, and maybe as a way of clout, trying to impress the younger people in there that were really obsessed with war games and war in general. And, ostensibly, this stuff, because of course was being placed here, started getting placed in other places. And these documents had an insane array of information, whatever is true, and whether Jack Texera was the one that definitely leaked it, whether he was the one that allegedly leaked it, or it was someone else. But what was in the documents is crazy. The kind of thing like this that would get out into the public. Part of it involved details on the mercenary Wagner Group's operations in Africa. Many people might know that that's run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's basically Putin's chef, as he's called, and it's his own private mercenary army, and they're in the middle of the worst battle in Ukraine right now for, effectively in the middle, the Donbass region. And apparently something to do with top secret information about their movements in Africa. Also, Israel's pathways to providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And then also intelligence about the United Arab Emirates' ties to Russia and South Korean concerns about providing ammunition to the U.S. for use in Ukraine. Not to mention that it had all kinds of things that had to do with the U.S.'s estimations of how well Ukraine was faring, what the Russian army might do, what their limitations were, all kinds of crazy top secret information. So now if Jack Texera was the one that, as we say, allegedly leaked this information, how did he get this? He's basically a National Guard airman. How did he come into contact with this classified information? Who knows? But what is true is no matter what the case may be, he was identified by the New York Times, and then just an hour and a half later, the FBI arrested him at his home. And effectively, in the midst of that, he has been charged of retention and transmission of national defense information and willful retention of classified documents. We'll keep you posted on this if it has any more connection to the world of games, and it kind of seems incidental that somehow it ended up on a Minecraft server and it was there for like months and nobody really noticed. But, wow, crazy digital world that we live in. And now moving on into the world of, I guess you could call it television. Streaming television certainly qualifies as television in this day and age. HBO Max, which has been the streaming arm of the home box office, or HBO, as it used to be known as a cable network, has now basically, and they used to be called HBO Go for a minute, and then they just rebranded as HBO Max, and then they put a bunch of, the whole Warner, content that Warner Brothers, the studio and the production company, owns. Well, apparently now, because of the merger that happened in the last year, HBO Max and Discovery Plus are going to merge into a new service, which has been, I guess, somewhat underwhelmingly called Max. And now all of that content is going to exist in one home. So anything that was on Discovery Plus and anything that was on HBO Max is all kind of merged in together, and they offered different price points. And this is obviously the next step in what is the current stage of the streaming wars. We talked a little bit last year about how HBO Max was starting to deep six content. There were certain shows that they didn't really want, and quite infamously, shows that got canceled, like Westworld, which was an amazing show. Westworld basically got moved off the platform. Whether that was for royalties and residuals paid to the cast and creators, who knows? But they essentially got moved to freemium networks where, they were ad supported networks because HBO didn't really want to host it anymore, which is crazy considering how much money they spent making Westworld and how lauded it was and award winning the show was. But whatever the case may be, now this new formulation is Max. And Max, basically, they came out guns blazing to announce a whole ton of new content behind this new version of their streaming platform. And amidst these things, the many things that are going to be in there, they basically indicated there was going to be a whole new Harry Potter series. Harry Potter fans out there, if you're watching this, love to hear what you think, but ostensibly, the whole world got done, a little over 10 years ago, watching the end of a giant series of Harry Potter movies that were very much beloved. And there's a legion of Harry Potter fans out there. Are you ready to see the whole story told from scratch all over again? Because by all reports, that's what the show is going to be. It's going to be a retelling of the books and done in a serial form instead of just movies like the last set were. There's a new show called The Regime, starring Kate Winslet. There's going to be a new installment of True Detective, which has, of course, been its own bottle series season where, each season is basically led by a different cast. The first season being Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, and then the second season having Vince Vaughn and, Rachel McAdams, and now last season, being Mahershala Ali. Well, apparently this season is going to be starring Jodie Foster, and it's called True Detective Night Country, apparently taking place in Alaska, where they get to the point where the sun never really comes out. There's the show that's been talked about for quite a while, but now they finally showed some footage of, which is Penguin, which is be inside the Batman universe, inside the Matt Reeves Batman universe, and everything that's been happening there, and starring Colin Farrell and as the Penguin and an elaborate prosthetic suit so that he's almost unrecognizable as Colin Farrell. And lastly, essentially, a show that I'm really excited about, and it'll probably take a while before it comes to pass, but it's another extension of the Game of Thrones universe, and it is based on kind of the series of short stories and novellas that George R. R. Martin's written for a lot of years, all within his continuity of Westeros and, Game of Thrones. And it's for Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And the first part of it, at least what they're calling it at this point, is the Hedge Knight. And that follows a story of a character called Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire, which is Aegon Targaryen, one of the many Targaryens in this crazy lineage that George R. R. Martin's created in the story. So that is going to be another Game of Thrones show that's going to be coming to the air on HBO. And then lastly, we shift over to the world of music, and probably the biggest hot button thing happening right now, and probably one of the biggest stories in some years, I would say. I mean, minus anything death and destruction, of course, unfortunate news like that. Coachella happened last weekend, the first of two Coachella weekends. We talked about Coachella a few times on this show before, and has been for many years kind of the heartbeat of the industry as far as music is concerned, where a lot of people's time and attention would be. And of course, for basically any festival that is shy of Glastonbury or Roskilde, what every festival wishes they were. What every festival wishes that they could be in terms of success and acclaim. People come from all over the world to see Coachella. And this particular year, it was headlined by Bad Bunny and Blackpink, and then Frank Ocean. All kinds of different stuff happened. There were decent acts playing throughout the weekend. Linda's played. Chromeo did a set that was really interesting, and effectively, had LaRue show up as a special guest, and then, Labyrinth had Billie Eilish show up as a surprise guest. And of course, just like everything, there's always newsworthy things that happen. Sophie Tucker did a show that was really good. And this time, Coachella tried as best as they could to try to live stream as much of it as possible across 6 different feeds. There are 6 of their main stages. That's not all the stages. There's other places that bands play, but those are like the stages where anybody of consequence is really playing, and effectively put as much of it as they could on the air to live stream it. And it reflects, as we talked about in the show in the past, right, like the changing prevailing tastes of the audience, music fans around the world. And ostensibly, how things that might have been a big deal a while ago aren't so much of a big deal anymore, just because of how youth and music taste has evolved over time. That's why Bad Bunny can headline over Gorillaz, right? That's why Blackpink, can headline over the Breeders, or that's why Frank Ocean can headline over Bjork. And effectively, Frank Ocean kind of ended up being the hot button moment of everything that was happening, because effectively everyone was kind of really, really excited to see what he would do. Now, Frank Ocean, if you're not familiar, came up as, an R&B hip hop adjacent singer from the Odd Future Wolfgang Kill Them All collective, which is of course where Tyler the Creator and so many different people, Left Brain and then Sid the Kid, from the internet and everything, they all came out of that collective, which was when they first came out an incredibly exciting group and collective. They've all gone on to do different things. Tyler the Creator's probably the most successful of the group, along with Frank Ocean, but ostensibly Frank Ocean became really successful behind a series of albums that kind of stopped short at 2016: Nostalgia Ultra, Channel Orange, Endless, and then the very critically acclaimed Blonde. And, was at the time doing shows and festivals. The average stuff a performer would do was really gaining in popularity. And then, not too long after Blonde, it kind of became like this era's Guns N' Roses, right? Like it kind of became this: Frank Ocean was booked for something, Frank Ocean probably would cancel. There was all kinds of fests, including Coachella and FYF Fest, where he was slated to headline and then something happened and then ultimately backed out of the performance. And it kind of became this like, is this going to happen? Is something else afoot? No one really knows anything. I mean, dude doesn't really give interviews. There isn't really a lot of information out there. There's a lot of speculation. There's people in social media going rampant about it. Whatever the case may be, whatever the truth is and whatever the problems are behind, why Frank Ocean hasn't really showed up to play something, whether it's some kind of meticulous craftsmanship and wanting things to be as perfect as humanly possible, or drama, nonsense, who knows? No one really knows, honestly, and it's all speculation to that extent. But whatever the case actually is, a lot of people have wanted to see Frank Ocean play live. So, of course, Coachella being the perfect proving ground for that, right? The biggest stage imaginable. Coachella came out in the run up to this festival indicating that, all the main stage headliners would be on the live stream. Now, Sunday, 4/16, 4 days ago, basically comes, and everyone's waiting for the schedule of the live stream to come out, and people weren't at the festival, and essentially somewhere around 3 p.m. it's just announced Frank Ocean won't be on the live stream. No one really, still to this point, as of this point of reporting, knows why, but apparently Frank Ocean decided he wasn't okay with being on the live stream after all. Now that could come down to financial negotiations and things like that. It might be that he wanted a premium for it. They might not wanted to play it, or maybe he just didn't want it to be broadcast that way. Maybe he wanted to be more intimate. But whatever the case may be, a whole lot of people in the world that couldn't be at Coachella were determined to see what he finally sounded like. We're super excited to see him, and then we're immediately disappointed. And so, of course, enter the internet. And legions of people essentially started trying to broadcast the show themselves on Instagram or TikTok. And one particular young high school girl who went by the Instagram handle Morgan Doesn't Care apparently had internet access well enough to, kind of like sideways, portrait mode or whatever. It wasn't entirely super viewable, live stream the whole show herself. So instead of a professional multi-camera array that made it look and sound good, people all around the world were watching bootlegs of it to just be able to see what happened. Now, as the show kind of creeped up, there was reports and crazy reporting and information and social media about how like legions of Frank Ocean fans were really, really, really hungry and desperate to get merchandise of Frank Ocean. And then there was a video that made the rounds from Stereogum and other outlets that we compete with that basically there was no Frank Ocean merch. So there's a pretty giant merch area at Coachella's, and so many bands play. And I mean, if you're in the business of music, you'd be a fool not to bring merch to this festival. I mean, you're going to sell a ton. Maybe it has to be sold at an uptick. Maybe you have to sell at higher in price than you really want to. But at the same time, people are going to buy your stuff there. It's always just this writhing mass of people buying merch. And apparently all kinds of jokes about people like camping out, trying everything in their power to try to, essentially get the merch, getting there, no merch. It's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, no merch. And then eventually, I don't know, someone from Golden Voice's staff putting up a sign saying no Frank Ocean merch. And so there's a video circulating, in Instagram and other circles where, you see someone in the merch booth holding up a sign for everyone to see that says no Frank Ocean merch. And people just start throwing out numbers like it's an auction, like they're trying to buy the sign because they want something of the moment and there's nothing there. So then finally the set time comes and Frank Ocean goes to go on, and Frank Ocean isn't there. over an hour goes by where the fans that are in attendance are waiting, and Frank Ocean never ends up going live. It's like an hour before it finally happens, and he's just about over an hour late when he finally goes on the air sometime after 11 o'clock. So then he goes and he performs his show. And interestingly, it's kind of like a series of video walls with like kind of a rectangle cut out of it. And so you kind of see him through like a window box. I don't really know how to describe it. I don't know what it was meant to be, but effectively it was kind of closed off, and that effectively there he is kind of in between that, sometimes moving around, but then other times just sitting. And it was curious, right? Like, he did his thing, he performed, and he's certainly loved for a good reason. People like his music very well, and always appreciated what he's put out. Whatever I've heard from him, it's never been a thing that I ever thought wasn't deserving of the acclaim that it gets. But there were points that were visible for those that were there, or those that recorded footage for social media of what was there, where you can see him not singing. He obviously was singing at times, but he could have had some kind of a backing track behind his vocals with his voice. And sometimes he would just enjoy listening to the sound of his own voice, which is curious. Sometimes he would just be sitting, seeming disinterested. I mean, it's pretty safe to say this wasn't the enigmatic and incredible show that a lot of people hope for. He did have a live band, which is great. Apparently, at one point during the set, he ceded the performance to about 20 minutes to his DJ, one of the members of the band, to play deep cuts of some of his songs or remixes of some of his songs. And he kind of gave a half-hearted explanation about how he'd been into kind of radio nights and things like that, and that's been a big thing for him in his world at this point. And so 20 minutes of this, what you're about to learn, truncated set, essentially given over to DJ. Okay, sure. And then at some point not long after that, he had a young gentleman come out and play piano and sing one of his songs. And he didn't sing it. He let this young guy sing the song, and he kind of gave some kind of statement like, this is my inner child coming up here to, live out my dreams of when I was younger. I don't know. And then somewhere around like 12:25, he basically unceremoniously came to the crowd and and essentially said, they're telling me I'm past curfew. The show's over. He walked off, and the whole crowd was in disbelief. Less than an hour and a half up on the air and ostensibly gone. Now, word broke quickly that there was something more than meets the eye behind this. And of course there would be. How could such a big headliner wanted for such a long time, essentially end up being something that, would just happen like that, just kind of blink and it's gone kind of thing. And there was a random Twitter user who went by the name Festive Owl, who claimed to have sources within Coachella and the workers, who indicated that he believed that there was an ice rink that was stated to be on the stage show. And this is what this person alleged. Nobody in authority has admitted this to being true at this point. But effectively, he alleges that somewhere in the early afternoon, Frank Ocean said, tear down the ice rink and melt the ice and get rid of it. And you don't, I'm canceling. This is what this person alleged. Nobody at Frank Ocean's camp, his management, his PR, or Coachella has said that. But a lot of outlets picked up and ran with it, and a lot of outlets ultimately reported on it. Now, as time has gone on, many outlets have been starting to really hunt for this story, and some of it has seemed to bear out, where effectively a couple of different skaters, a guy by the name of Dan and Chris Powers from an Empty Netters podcast, basically indicated, yes, there was something in the neighborhood of 120 skaters that had been conscripted to be part of a stage show that was going to be that was rehearsed for a long time. And other reporting came out while the people were looking into what was going on. Was there going to be an ice rink? Was there going to be part of a show for that? And then apparently it's was indicated that apparently Frank Ocean had injured his leg sometime in the week up to the festival as he was preparing for the show. And that might have been why he was sitting down so much in the show. And who knows, maybe it had something to do with why this alleged ice rink was canceled. And so effectively, Dan and Chris Powers have their own podcast, the Empty Netters podcast, where they basically talked about how they'd rehearsed for a month leading up to the show. And then they did not know that something was going to change about the production until just a few hours leading up to the headlining set. And they said that, we get our call sheet. We have to go to this hotel, be picked up by a runner to be brought over to wardrobe and makeup. That moment is where the wheels started to fall off. We get to this hotel. We're told to be there by noon. We then get a text that, the runner's not going to come till 1. Then we then get another text, they're not going to come till 3. Then Dan Powers adds, It's a nightmare. We sit at this hotel and we run into the figure skaters, these Olympic figure skaters, mind you, and they have a disgruntled look on their faces. And they casually mention to us that they just got a phone call and they've been cut from the show, that we've been cut from the show. So, ostensibly, this is what they're alleging. Once again, nobody in authority has confirmed that this is happening, but it seems to be there seems to be evidence that there were people hired to do some kind of ice skating thing, and whether that was something that Frank Ocean threatened Coachella with, tear it down and cancel it, who knows? That's literally comes from one person and their own secret anonymous reporting on Twitter. So maybe that had something to do with it, maybe not. But the net total of it was just yesterday. And this wasn't hard to predict if you follow these kinds of things. It was announced by Frank Ocean that he was no longer going to be headliner for weekend 2 coming up, in just 4 days. Just 4 days from this moment. So Coachella, basically after years of preparation, this is, of course, last year the festival successfully happened, but in the years prior, several years canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Rage Against the Machine was going to headline one year, and Travis Scott was going to headline, and all that stuff been scrapped, and Frank Ocean slated to play one time, didn't happen, and effectively now halfway in the middle of the 2 gigantic weekends of the festival, no headliner for the festival. Frank Ocean's statement on everything essentially indicated that it was because of his leg, that it was his doctor's orders that he wasn't going to be playing. I mean, I don't know. It seems a little suspect to me. I wouldn't, second guess it. He might be injured, and that sucks if he is. But it doesn't feel like that's kind of really what's going on here, at least in some level. And ostensibly, it's announced that not only will he not be playing, but that Blink-182, who were announced late last weekend as a secret performer, were going to be replacing him in the Sunday night time slot. Now, literally about an hour and a half ago, the set times for weekend 2 of Coachella just got announced. So people who are going there tomorrow are just now finding out what's going to happen when and where they can, essentially plan their days. And the Coachella set times list a TBA headliner above Frank Ocean. Frank Ocean, ahead of Blink-182. And, a lot of people are angry. A lot of people are upset. I can't imagine what a diehard Frank Ocean fan who spent a fortune, because Coachella is not cheap, and staying out there, unless you're camping, and that's still at expense and uncomfortable. It can be 100 degrees out there every day. If someone had spent a fortune to come see Frank Ocean, I can't imagine how they feel right now. They have to be so mad and so bummed. Maybe some of them are just happy they got to see it at all. Or of course, especially if you went for weekend 2 and you were expecting him to be there and now he's not. I'm sure there's some crossover between Frank Ocean fans and Blink-182 fans, but I mean, probably not a ton too. It's probably not the same fan base as, one of the most popular bratty pop punk bands of, the pre 9/11 era. So this all reminds me too painfully well of a story that I told years ago, going back 8 years ago in Mixdown, and this very much is reminiscent of that kind of thing for me. And all due respect to Frank Ocean, what he's known for, what he's capable of, certainly made a lot of great music. Everyone certainly wants him to succeed. People want him to be a giant arena stadium sellout, someone that could headline a big festival like Coachella. I mean, Billie Eilish can do it. She's not that old. She hasn't been around that long, and she can successfully headline a festival like this. Why couldn't Frank Ocean? A lot of people deserve to have him championed. He certainly represents a lot of different things to people that a lot of people really want out of music. He obviously is good at what he does. But how does something like this happen? I mean, was it just injuries? And if that was the case, should he have even gone on the stage at all? I'm reminded of the debacle that happened with Sly and the Family Stone at Coachella 2010, where whoever promised Coachella that Sly Stone was in a pace that he was healthy enough to do a performance like that was just really irresponsible. It just shouldn't have happened. So this reminds me of a story going back to South by Southwest 2015, and that'll be, our story for today, where we'll end on. And I've talked a little bit on the show before about, South by Southwest and how it's essentially this giant rock and roll party town, and, just an amazing, incredible experience, just going across small venues all over town, hopping and bopping from one show to another and seeing amazing stuff. Now, for those of us who went in those years between 2000 and, roughly 2016, there was a lot of good years of a lot of really amazing things happening. And one of the things that became kind of a staple of it was an event thrown by Cornerstone Promotions, the company that's behind the Fader, the magazine, and it was usually referred to as the Fader Fort. And it had a pretty intelligent mix of different kinds of things that would happen there. I mean, everything from, a garage psych band like the Warlocks to Matt and Kim and Erica Badu. There's a very famous Kanye West show that happened there at the end one year. Miley Cyrus showed up one time. I saw an incredible show once where the Afghan Wigs were joined by Usher and they did a set together. It was awesome. And it was really great. Just wonderful, wonderful marriage of two very different sounds. Of course, Damon Albarn did a whole massive thing there where, it was kind of behind his solo material, but then it became a Gorillaz set. And De La Soul came out and did a bunch of songs with him. And then they had the first time ever that Dan the Automator and Del the Funky Homo Sapien basically joined him to do Clint Eastwood. And, then joined not only by them, but also by Snoop Dogg for a verse. I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing. The Fader Fort did a lot of really impressive stuff. Oftentimes, too, usually sponsored by a major corporate sponsor, a lot of times with Levi's and different companies like that. But, it escapes me in 2015 who was behind it. So this particular year, there were two unannounced surprise guests listed as the last day Saturday of the Fader Fort. And being a journalist such as I am and a glutton for news, went there hoping something exciting would happen. There's always something interesting happening at the Fader Fort. It was always really fun, and it was always a great show, and a lot of people, more of a hip-hop centric, fan base in a general sense, but a lot of people super, super jazzed about seeing what the Fader would do with the Fader Fort. So this particular year, I didn't have any other things that were going on that day of South by Southwest, so I just kind of camped out there to see the things that were happening there. And then all in one succession, there was essentially a group of artists that performed, and one of them was Alex G, who's gotten a lot more popular nowadays, and then Porter Robinson, and then Tink, who hasn't seemed to live up to what it looked like. She looked like she was going to be a star and hasn't really done much, or I'm not hearing much about her anymore, but she was great. And then essentially the secret guests. So this was kind of an awful day, right? Like, it is a free event. It isn't a ticketed event, but the people that were there were super jazzed about seeing what could be done there and what was happening there. They were down to party. They were down to have a good time. Even though these kids or young adults, whatever you want to say, that were there at the Fader Fort may not have been paid ticket attendees, they were super jazzed about wanting to see something cool and exciting. And Alex G spent most of the set making fun of it, making fun of the crowd, making fun of the event, basically just punking off. Obviously just didn't really care. And I think spent a lot of time making fun of the secret unannounced headliner. It was kind of abominable, and it just looked like an inherent disdain for the moment, the occasion. And think about it. I mean, maybe him and some of the other people I'm about to mention were bad that they weren't being paid or paid enough to play this show, because South by Southwest has notoriously been a thing where bands kind of come for PR hype, play for free or play for peanuts to be able to, reach this many people. But there were thousands and thousands of people at this event in this open air thing that was, big stage, great lighting, great setup, filmed the whole thing. Great way to reach a huge audience, especially if you were Alex G at that time and you didn't have a gigantic audience. So that was aggravating. And then that was followed by Porter Robinson, who has certainly become very popular as but playing at Coachella this just weekend that just went by. And as I quote from my own story from 2015, Porter Robinson's words upon taking the stage were, "So I'm going to do a DJ set for 25 minutes. I guess it's like 5 songs." And then went on to play a set where didn't really seem to care that he was there or what he was doing. So more inherent disdain for the crowd at hand. Tink, to her credit, did a great show, and Timbaland joined her and was mugging it up and being really, really silly and really, really hyping up Tink, and that was fun. So at least that was good. But then the big, whatever you want to call it, the secret finale of things started to play out. Now, for historical note, this was the year Kanye West was supposed to be, one of a couple different years Kanye West was going to be at South by Southwest, and he certainly did do that a couple times and did a few really exciting shows. One time at the Vivo Power Station, for example, a couple years earlier. But anyway, this particular year, he was supposed to be there and apparently canceled lots of different things, including Jimmy Kimmel, and then didn't really show up for a lot of stuff that maybe he was supposed to. No one really announced anything because it was supposed to be a secret. So a lot of people had jumped to the conclusion that this secret headliner slot was going to be Kanye. So then Hudson Mohawk, who was on the time on Warp Records, was kind of a DJ, electronic musician, comes out and he starts doing his very glitchy thing. And he's doing that for a little bit. No one's really sure quite what's happening or if this is what the big surprise is. And then all of a sudden, Travis Scott comes out, the rapper. Now, Travis Scott is now, legendary by recent history because of the debacle at his show in Texas, where there was like a stampede and people were dying in the crowd or very badly injured in the crowd, and he was still performing, and there was a lot of heat that came on him for that. But this set was kind of an abomination. And it was awful. And there were certainly some excitement for him to be there, but Travis Scott was, I don't know. I didn't ask him and I don't have any on the record, but by visually looking at him, he looked like he was high. I would, say he looked as if he had been under the influence of something, because he didn't really finish a single song. He didn't really perform a whole set. He kind of would like do a little part, tell Hudson Mohawk to do some little bit of a song, and then he would just kind of stare at him. And at some points, he came out into the photo pit, and the crowd would get really excited, like something was going to happen. And then he would turn around and look at Hudson Mohawk from 50 feet away and go. Some point, 20, 30 minutes of this, and there's 30 photographers in the photo pit, and all these people are in there going, what the hell is going on here? And effectively, Twista, who some of you may or may not know, Twista was known originally as Tongue Twista, one of the world's fastest rappers, and was in the Guinness Book of World Records at one point. Twista effectively runs out, does a few verses of bars of something, everyone starts cheering for a second, and then Twista runs off stage. And then it's just Travis Scott. And then so essentially, someone finally, I guess, convinces Travis Scott to get up and leave. It all just kind of ends with a whimper. And this comes from the piece that I wrote the following day. Okay. A few minutes after Hudson Mohawk concluded, an announcer came over the speakers, thanked everyone for attending the event, and stated flatly that the event was over. The disappointed crowd booed loudly, clearly expecting something far greater for an ending or a much larger surprise guest. For a few moments, there was even a chant of bullshit. Odds are several large names canceled, but we may never know for sure what was really going to happen. Teasing a special guest and often having huge ones can create a predicament and rendering impossible to satiate expectations. The Fader can be forgiven for the way this played out. They have produced several years' worth of incredible events and never charged anyone 1 red cent for them. Bands cancel. Artists cannot be controlled. Things happen. But for everyone except for Timbaland and Tank listed above, why even show up? Why bother? Why have such disdain for your audience? Worse yet, such disdain for yourself and your own position. How many bands or artists would jump out of their own skin at a chance to play at a show of that importance with several thousand people in attendance and live stream to the whole world? Blah. Utter prima donna nonsense and stupidity. I walked away from that event just, wow. I mean, I suppose if you're Travis Scott, you're probably making enough money that you don't care and it's not a big deal. You probably weren't being paid very well for that event, but why even show up? Why agree to do it? So many people want to be in music. So many people are trying so hard to make a living. And there are reports left, right, and center. Today we had reporting on Mixdown in our music section about how Anthrax is having to cancel a tour because it's too expensive to go over to Europe. We had reporting last year on this show about Animal Collective, which is a pretty big band, having to cancel their tour in Europe because inflation is so out of control. It's getting hard to afford everything. There are reports all throughout the music business of very good people not being able to make it. Now, in that particular day, in the story that I told back in 2015, which I called South by Southwest 2015's Last Day, the Dillinger Escape Plan, and Why Music Doesn't Have to Suck, I went on to a different event, which was essentially the Thrasher Magazine party, which is, thrown by Thrasher Magazine, kind of escape magazine and culture magazine. And they had Sick of It All and the Dillinger Escape Plan, who broke up not long after that. And, Greg Puciato and Ben Weinman from the band have gone on to do all different kinds of things since then. But at this point, this was before Dillinger Escape Plan had broke up. So Sick of It All is a famous New York hardcore band. Total opposite, right? We're talking everything about everyone have a good time. Everyone be happy. Everyone, this should be catharsis for you. This should be about feeling better about your world and your life. You might have to go to work on Monday. Come, release, let go. If somebody falls, pick them up. Make sure they don't get hurt. I mean, people who are fans of classic New York and, Northeast United States hardcore are going to be terribly surprised to hear that. And I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily a hardcore evangelist either, even growing up in Connecticut where hardcore was really popular, but it was refreshing to say the least. And then the Dillinger Escape Plan came on and did what they do, which was decimate. Like, if someone could literally bottle the last throes of their life force and push it out an instrument or a voice, and to put all the vitality of like, the world is ending, I'm going to save the world from ending, like every corny action movie you've ever seen, that was this show. It was literally vitality defined. It was in every way, shape, and form the power and the fury of really giving a shit. I was telling some people at Mixdown just the other day that the aftermath of this event, seeing how much every little bit mattered in terms of what they did, basically inspired a mantra for me that has infected everything that I do since, which is just simply put in 2 words: care more. Care about everything you do. Care about anything you bother to do. If you're bothering to do it, give a shit. Give a shit more. Don't look at the people who make it possible for you to do something with disdain. I mean, Ani DeFranco once wrote pretty intelligently, maybe you don't like your job. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep. Nobody likes their job. Nobody got enough sleep. Just suck up and be nice. And ostensibly, this particular, A to B, going from an event where bands acted with disdain for the audience, for the fans, for the moment, whatever the case may be, to this other event where you could see, we're not going to do this unless we put our heart and soul on the line, even if it's not for enough money. Holy smokes. And this is what I wrote in a summation of a very, very large piece, and tie this back together as we end our broadcast here. And that's the rub. There is a through line between Laura Marling, Charles Bradley, Run the Jewels, TV on the Radio, Doomtree, Future Islands, and Dillinger Escape Plan. These bands all played South by Southwest that year, by the way. They have respect for themselves and respect for their audience. Watching the Dillinger Escape Plan, they were not happy unless every second that was put forth with 100% of what they had to offer. And what's more, the same for the audience. It was leave everything on the table or do nothing at all. Go big or go home, as the old cliche states. It matters. It really does. Music does not have to suck. Whatever it is that an artist puts forth, if it doesn't really include this level of commitment and care, why even do it? It's not lack of options or access that's hampering the music industry. It's a lack of self-respect and a lack of respect for the hearts and minds of the music-consuming public. Immense talent can help, but it's something more we should all be reaching for. There's no price tag you can put on purity. Now, I think back to that moment and what I'm sure a lot of Frank Ocean fans are feeling, and there's probably some degree of buyer's remorse, sticker shock. I don't know. What's really behind this will probably play out for years, and I would assume that this is probably going to be damaging to Frank Ocean's career for many years to come. If I was a festival promoter, I would be a little nervous about booking someone like this. I mean, hey, people get injured, and if it was a serious injury that could have been avoided, then maybe the whole thing just shouldn't have happened. But does it really feel like that to you as the viewer? As you watch what's transpired, if you read these accounts of the things that were going on, I mean, so much money on the line. And so many bands would gnaw their arm off to have that opportunity to play for that many people, to make that kind of money behind it when it's getting so hard to be able to afford to do this. Is there really just a logistical rat's nest of complications that caused this to blow up? Or is there some measure of entitlement, something that leads someone or their representatives to think, who cares what we do? We are this thing, so we can do whatever. And who gives a shit? It's worth demanding more. And my heart goes out to any Frank Ocean fans that are disappointed right now. There's probably a lot of you. And for those of you that enjoyed what you saw, cool, good. I'm glad it worked for you. I'm super glad that it wasn't terrible and disappointing. I would be disappointed if I was a fan of him on the level that a lot of people are. And that's what I got. That's all for This Week is Live. Thank you again so much for joining us. Sorry we didn't have a show last week. Some life things came up, and effectively we had to just kind of the last second scrap the show. And, sort of all's well that ends well. Effectively, tons of important stuff we had to talk about this week, and we'll be back every week just like this. Thursday afternoon, usually between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. Pacific time. We're going to have all kinds of special stuff coming this year. There's a lot more coming. I know I've been teasing it for months, but I promise it's happening. It's coming. It's going to happen. And ostensibly, for any of you who don't already, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Please follow us on Twitch. Join us for the live broadcast every Thursday when we go live. Or if you engage with this content on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, or in YouTube Shorts. We thank you so much for your attention, so much for your interest. Please continue to join us every week, and we'll have a lot more for you in this format on This Week is Live. Thanks again. So glad to see you well.